Let us bow our heads in prayer. Gracious God, be near to each one of us. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So we've begun a journey through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, the famous 12 steps. And last week we began with an introduction to the series. We're going to continue this series right through the entire summer. If you'd like to catch up on last Sunday's sermon, there are copies on the back table, or you can go to www.wallstreetchurch.com and find it there. Today we are at the beginning of the 12 steps. We are looking at the first two steps. Steps number 1 and 2. Number 1, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. And step 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Nobody likes a failure. But we recognize that in life, times of failure happen. We wish it wasn't so. We wish we couldn't be knocked down by life. I think we wish we were a bit like the Weebles. Anybody remember the Weebles? I think you got to be about my age, or maybe have been a parent to somebody my age to remember the Weebles. Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. I think we wish that when life knocked us down, we would just bounce right back up and have that perfect little smile still on our face no matter what happens. But that's not the way life works. Sometimes you do fall down and you can't get back up by yourself. Sometimes it has to do with what we've self-inflicted, what we've done to ourselves. Whether we've done something or not done something, and as a result we've messed up a marriage or lost a job. Perhaps our health is a mess because we haven't managed our weight or our sugar levels, or through smoking, or maybe all of the above because of an addiction to drugs and alcohol. Our life just becomes a mess. Sometimes we fall down because of something that has nothing to do with what we've done, a diagnosis of cancer or a terminal or chronic illness, somebody leaving us because they found somebody else, or the economy crashing and you losing your job because of circumstances beyond our means, or you lose your investments with a market crash. Sometimes we end up in that pit of failure, in that pit of not being able to get ourselves back up. Still, we think we should be Weebles. We think that's how we have to be. We have to get up on our own. We have to be smiling and fighting. My good friend and congregation member Heather Irely posted a blog this week. Wave, Heather. Of course, nobody can see you, but she's up there. Posted a blog from a woman who calls herself Uzma MD, and Uzma has metastatic breast cancer. In other words, her breast cancer spread and is now at a stage 4. And she talked about this phenomenon, how we always talk about fighting cancer. And I'm just going to read from her blog. She said, "Everyone said, you're going to beat it. Some said, if anyone can, you can. They cheered me on as I endured one treatment after another, and I kept fighting like a girl. I was told I will kick cancer's ass, and I will show cancer who's boss. Positivity and determination. I believed that I would beat cancer too. I thrived on the fantasy of cancer submitting to my will and my strength." But she didn't beat cancer. When she got the call that her cancer had metastasized, she was devastated and she felt like a failure. And Heather echoed those sentiments when her cancer also spread, when it came back. Uzma continues in her blog to say, "But as time went on, I also worked hard on accepting what having cancer meant. It meant accepting a life that you have no control over, life which transitions between sweet fantasies and harsh realities. The truth is, we were born powerless, and we will die powerless. And any power that we have in the middle of life is largely a myth. The truth is, we don't like to admit that. We don't like to admit our powerlessness because it reminds us of our mortality. It reminds us of our limitations and our utter frailty. But when we are aware of that frailty, when we end up in a place of powerlessness, when we open our eyes, we can see that can be a tremendous gift that comes to us in that place. This Sunday and these steps are about hitting the bottom and the surprising gift of new life that you can find in that place. My guess is that every person in this room has tasted failure. My guess is that every person in this room has experienced defeat. And the truth is, it doesn't matter whether that was just something that happened to you or whether it was somewhat self-inflicted. When you're in that place, you are powerless over it. I used the story of the prodigal son this morning because to me it exemplified this. It's a story of epic failure, awakening, and new life. The prodigal son goes from having a normal and good life. He has the audacity to ask his father for his inheritance before his father's even died. And then he goes out, with more money than he knows what to do with and just spends it like an absolute fool on, wine, women, and songs, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, whatever. And then he ends up crashing at the bottom. He ends up with absolutely nothing. He ends up, in fact, so low that he's feeding pigs better food than he's eating himself. Now, let me tell you, if you're a good Jewish boy, a good kosher Jewish boy, and you're feeding big pigs, you're at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. There is absolutely no lower you can go. No one willingly goes to that place. But a strange gift can come to us in that place. It's in that place that the prodigal son wakes up. It's in that place that the prodigal son comes to his senses and realizes that he would be better going home. And he goes home in absolute humility, offers himself to his father's grace, and finds new life. That's our faith. Whatever we want to call it, weakness or powerlessness or defeat, Richard Rohr calls this God's greatest surprise and constant disguise. I love that. God's greatest surprise and constant disguise is powerlessness. I don't entirely understand it, but as you read the scriptures over and over, it is clear that that's how God works. God works out of powerlessness. Remember that God became human. The incarnation is in the form of the most fragile, helpless newborn baby. God begins life as a human the same way we all do, powerless. Jesus was born also in total poverty. He began life as a refugee. And throughout his life and ministry, he's a nobody. He doesn't have degrees or wealth or anything else. And then this incredible ministry of Jesus ends in torture and death. It ends in total failure, or at least total seeming failure. There's a Mexican proverb that I saw on the internet this week that goes, "They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds." They tried to bury Jesus, but they didn't know that he was the seed of life. And he came to life. He came to life to bring us life. And that life continues to grow such that we are here today, and the Christian church is growing around the world. There's something about waking up in our place of absolute vulnerability and powerlessness that helps to bring a new day and new life. But in order to do that, I guess we have to stop singing, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble." That's where the steps of AA begin. They begin in total resignation and humility. It's almost like there is no room for God if we are filled with our own ego and our own strength. As long as we keep fighting and saying, "I can do it," there's no room for God to move into our lives. But when life brings us to our knees, somehow we open up and there's room for God to move in and to be born in a new way, the things we thought we could do. And we are willing to take on new things, new ways of doing things. I believe that these seeds are planted in the hearts of individuals, but they can make national difference. They can make a difference in our communities and in our world as well. The Oscar Romero, there's a film about Oscar Romero called, surprisingly, Romero. The film covers 3 years that Romero was the Archbishop of San Salvador. And this was during the late 70s and 80s. El Salvador was torn apart by civil unrest. The ones who were the brunt of it were the poor of El Salvador. They were being murdered and mistreated. The government, government on the right they were murdering and torturing their people because they kept suspecting that they were part of the Marxist left and wanting to overthrow the government. Meanwhile, the Marxist left guerrillas were also torturing and murdering ordinary people and trying to convince them to overthrow the right-wing government. So the people were just caught in the middle of this. The Catholic Church at the time was on the side of the government, and Romero was appointed as Archbishop because he was a conservative, because the Catholic Church knew this was the kind of man not to make waves, not to make any changes, that he would just toe the line of the status quo. But Romero woke up. He came to his senses when his good friend and colleague, Rutilio Grande, was murdered less than 3 weeks after he became Archbishop. And Romero insisted that the government investigate this murder, and the government refused. So Romero, in turn, said, well, he would not attend any state functions, and famously, he didn't attend the president-elect's inauguration, Humberto's inauguration. And so as a result, Humberto closes his murdered friend's church in Aguilares, and not only closes it, but turns it into a military barracks. Romero, all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, I think it was very gradual for him, and that's significant. You know, step 2, I love that step 2 says, came to believe in a power greater than ourselves. Sometimes it happens in an instant, right? Sometimes conversion or awakening can happen in a moment. But more often than not, it's a process. It's a came to believe in a power greater than ourselves. One of the most powerful scenes in the Romero movie is when Romero goes to the place where his friend was murdered. It's literally at a crossroads. And in that moment, Romero drops to his knees and he prays this prayer. He prays, I can't, you must, I'm yours, show me the way. That's an incredibly simple but powerful prayer. And in my opinion, that prayer sums up those 2 steps of AA. I can't, you must, I'm yours, show me the way. There were 3 elements to Romero's conversion. The first was an awareness, not being in denial anymore. He woke up to how unmanageable, how horrible things were around him. That's the first step, waking up to the unmanageability of your life or the situation around. The second one was realizing his own smallness in that situation, his own powerlessness in that unmanageable situation. And then the third was surrendering to God's grace and God's power, which is very different from how we view power. Those are the same 3 elements that the prodigal son experienced in transformation. He had to wake up to the mess he'd made of his life. He had to recognize that he couldn't get up alone. We're such an individualistic society, and we think we have to do it ourselves. But you need community. And again, that's one of the gifts of the AA steps, is the community, the fellowship of AA that helps people to do it together. And in the same way, the prodigal son realizes he can't do it alone. He needs to go home. And he surrenders to his father, who, of course, in the story represents God and God's grace. That's how new life is born. And that's what we are called to. I don't know where your life is unmanageable. My hunch is there's a part of your life that is, a part of your life that you keep trying to change, but it doesn't work. There are also unmanageable situations, horribly unmanageable situations in our world. When I look at the U.S. and this whole racial how it's just erupted. Well, it's been there, but it just is so highlighted right now and just seems so, we seem so powerless in the face of it, or terrorism around the world, or the murdered and missing Aboriginal women, or. There's so many situations. But my prayer is that ordinary people will wake up, not be in denial anymore. We'll wake up to the situation. We'll confess our powerlessness, but most important of all, place our lives in God's life, in God's hands, so that we might do something to make a difference. That's how Moses led the people out of Egypt. That's how situations in the United States or in our community or in your own life will change, is when we do that. I can't, you must, I'm yours, show me the way. The prayer of the powerless is the beginning of a mighty and transformed life. Thanks be to God. Amen.